Welcome to Galactic University, where the motto is, learning through terror, and the student survival rate is exactly what you'd expect from an institution that thinks bringing live predators to class is educational policy. I'm talking about Xenobiology 101, the course that separates future xenobiologists from future statistics, taught by the one and only Professor Kethvar. Professor Kethvar was a Vorthak, which meant he looked like someone had taken a salamander, stretched it to 7 feet tall, given it delusions of grandeur, and dressed it in academic robes that cost more than most species' annual GDP. His skin had that lovely moist sheen that all amphibians possess, and his voice carried the kind of condescending tone that suggested he'd rather be dissecting his students than teaching them. "Welcome, hatchlings," Professor Kethvar announced on the first day, his bulbous eyes scanning the lecture hall like a predator evaluating prey, which, considering the syllabus, wasn't entirely metaphorical. "This semester, you will learn to identify, categorize, and survive encounters with the galaxy's most dangerous life forms. Those of you who make it to finals will have earned the right to call yourselves xenobiologists." The class roster was a delightful mix of species, each more terrified than the last. There was Pip, a Zephyrian exchange student whose natural state seemed to be barely visible panic. Zephyrians were essentially sentient clouds of nervous energy, and Pip had the distinction of being the only student who could literally fade from existence when stressed. His translucent blue form flickered constantly, like a hologram with connection issues. Then there was Thane, a Crystallian warrior scholar whose species had evolved from living gemstones. He stood nearly 8 feet tall and looked like someone had carved a bodybuilder out of amethyst and given him an attitude problem. Crystallians were proud, militant, and absolutely convinced that their crystal-based physiology made them superior to all organic life. Thane's particular shade of purple suggested he specialized in what his people called aggressive diplomacy. And finally there was Jake Martinez, human, who had somehow ended up in advanced xenobiology despite looking like he'd gotten lost on his way to a coffee shop. Jake was aggressively average in every way that mattered to galactic society. Medium height, brown hair, brown eyes, and the kind of relaxed demeanor that suggested either supreme confidence or complete obliviousness. Given that he was human, it could honestly go either way. "Now," Professor Kethvar continued, distributing datapads with a flourish that would have been impressive if it weren't so pretentious, "let us review the syllabus. Week 3, Carnivorous Plant Identification through Taste Testing. Week 7, Proper Etiquette when Dining with Species that Consider You a Delicacy. And Week 12, Surviving Close Encounters with Apex Predator Hatchlings." Pip immediately flickered out of visible existence. Thane's crystalline structure began developing stress fractures. Jake raised his hand. "Yeah, quick question," Jake said, his tone suggesting he was asking about the weather rather than potential death by predator. "Are we allowed to bring snacks to the predator encounter? Because I get cranky when I'm hungry, and that seems like poor planning for everyone involved." Professor Kethvar's eye membranes twitched, which was the Vortak equivalent of questioning one's life choices. "Mr. Martinez, this is a serious academic exercise, designed to test your ability to survive in xenobiological field conditions." "Right, absolutely," Jake nodded sagely. "So that's a yes on the snacks?" The professor's skin took on a slightly greener hue, which either meant he was impressed or developing an ulcer. Given the circumstances, it was probably the latter. This was going to be an interesting semester. And somewhere in the back of Jake's mind, a little voice that sounded suspiciously like his little sister whispered, "Wait until they meet the really scary stuff." 3 weeks into the semester, Professor Kethvar had successfully traumatized his students with carnivorous plants that screamed when you bit them, toxic fungi that made you hallucinate your own death, and a particularly unpleasant lecture on parasites that involved live demonstrations. The class had dwindled from 15 students to 8, which Professor Kethvar considered a rousing success. "Today," he announced with the kind of gleeful anticipation usually reserved for natural disasters, "we discuss your midterm practical examination." Pip immediately began flickering like a strobe light. Thane's crystal structure started making small pinging sounds that suggested structural damage. Jake continued eating what appeared to be a sandwich made from at least 3 different species of questionable origin. "You will each be required to spend 1 full hour in close proximity to a live apex predator hatchling," Professor Kethvar continued, clearly savoring the terror radiating from his students. "This exercise will test your ability to remain calm, observe behavioral patterns, and most importantly, survive." "Define close proximity," squeaked Pip, who was now roughly the consistency of morning fog. Within striking distance, naturally. We want this to be educational. Faint stress fractures were now visible from orbit. Professor, surely there are safety protocols. Containment fields, emergency extraction procedures? Professor Kethvar's smile revealed teeth that belonged in a horror movie. Where would be the educational value in that? This is how we separate the apex minds from the prey mentalities, young Christaglian. The galaxy has no patience for xenobiologists who faint at the first sign of actual danger. Jake raised his hand again, somehow managing to gesture with a sandwich without dropping any of the mysterious filling. Will the hatchling be fed beforehand? Because hungry predators are grumpy predators, and grumpy predators make poor study subjects. Trust me on this one. The professor's eye membranes did that twitchy thing again. There was something deeply unsettling about the human's casual attitude toward mortal peril. The hatchling will be in its natural state, Mr. Martinez. We are not running a petting zoo. Oh, sure, absolutely not, Jake agreed cheerfully. Though speaking of petting zoos, did I mention my little sister's pets back home? She's got this collection that would probably make your predator hatchling look like a stuffed animal. Kids these days, you know. No sense of appropriate danger levels. The classroom fell silent except for Pip's panicked flickering and the ominous cracking sounds coming from Thane's increasingly fractured form. Professor Kethvar stared at Jake with the kind of expression usually reserved for mathematical equations that refuse to balance. Your sister keeps apex predators as pets? Jake shrugged, taking another bite of his sandwich. Mom works in wildlife preservation. You pick up a few things growing up around the really dangerous stuff. Anyway, when's this practical exam happening? Because I've got a study group that night and I'd hate to reschedule. Professor Kethvar made a note on his datapad that probably read something like, investigate human psychological evaluation records, or possibly increase insurance coverage. Next week, Mr. Martinez. I do hope you're prepared. Jake grinned, and for just a moment Professor Kethvar could have sworn he saw something predatory flash behind those deceptively mild brown eyes. Oh, I'm always prepared, Professor. The question is whether your hatchling is ready for me. The following week arrived, with all the enthusiasm of a galactic audit, and the remaining students gathered in Laboratory 7, which had been specially reinforced for what Professor Kethvar cheerfully called educational carnage. The room looked like someone had designed a medical facility with the express purpose of containing nightmares. Reinforced walls, emergency medical stations, and what appeared to be several different types of body bags arranged neatly in one corner. Ah, excellent. Professor Kethvar announced as the last student filed in. I see we're all present. Well, mostly present. He glanced at Pip, who was currently about as substantial as a bad hologram. Today you meet your examination partner. The containment unit at the center of the room was roughly the size of a small shuttle, constructed from materials that could theoretically withstand a small nuclear explosion. Theoretically. The soft humming sound coming from within suggested something was very much awake, and very much interested in whatever was happening outside. Students, allow me to introduce a juvenile void stalker, approximately 6 months old and weighing in at a modest 230 pounds of pure apex predator evolution. Sane made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Pip flickered completely out of existence for a solid 10 seconds. Jake unwrapped what appeared to be a peanut butter sandwich and took a thoughtful bite. Void stalkers, Professor Kethvar continued with academic enthusiasm, are considered one of the galaxy's most perfect killing machines. They possess enhanced strength, speed, intelligence, and most notably the ability to phase partially out of normal space-time, making them nearly impossible to escape once they've chosen a target. The containment field shimmered and dissolved, and the class got their first look at nightmare fuel with cute ears. The Voidstalker hatchling was absolutely beautiful in the way that natural disasters are beautiful. Picture a panther that had been redesigned by someone with a PhD in terror and a minor in making things that should not exist. Its fur was a deep black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, broken by patches of what looked like starfield that shifted and moved across its coat, like living constellation maps. 6 legs ending in claws that could probably carve through battle armor, eyes that glowed with an inner light that suggested intelligence far beyond what any sane universe should allow in something with that many teeth, and a tail that moved with the kind of predatory grace that made seasoned warriors reconsider their career choices. It was also, Jake noted with professional interest, absolutely gorgeous. The hatchling emerged from its containment with the fluid motion of something that had never encountered an obstacle it couldn't simply remove from existence. It surveyed the room with those glowing eyes, taking in each student with the kind of assessment that usually preceded someone becoming a statistic. Pip had achieved a level of transparency previously thought impossible. Thane's crystalline structure was developing new fractures in real time, creating a sound like a xylophone being slowly destroyed. The other students had arranged themselves as far from the predator as physics would allow, which wasn't nearly far enough for their peace of mind. Jake continued eating his sandwich. The Voidstalker's attention swept across the terrified students and locked onto the one human in the room who was apparently more interested in his lunch than in the 200-pound apex predator that could phase through solid matter. Its ears pricked forward with what could generously be called curiosity and more accurately be called target acquisition. "Oh good," whispered one of the remaining students, a mollusk descendant whose name Jake had never caught. "It's chosen the human. I give him 47 seconds. 47 seconds seems optimistic, Thane managed through his stress fractures. I'm thinking more like 12. The Voidstalker padded forward with the kind of silence that made you question whether sound was still working properly. Each step was placed with perfect precision, those glowing eyes never leaving Jake, who had moved onto what appeared to be an apple and was examining it with the kind of attention usually reserved for complex mathematical equations. Professor Kethvar activated his recording equipment, clearly anticipating some excellent footage for next semester's introduction lecture. Remember, students, observe the predator's hunting patterns, note the stalking behavior, and try to learn something before the screaming starts. The Voidstalker was now within striking distance of Jake, close enough that its breathing created small clouds of vapor in the climate-controlled air. It paused, head tilted slightly, as if trying to figure out why this particular prey item wasn't showing appropriate signs of terror. Jake looked up from his apple, met those glowing predator eyes with mild curiosity, and said, "Hey there, gorgeous. You hungry?" What happened next was not covered in any xenobiology textbook ever written. The Voidstalker sat down, tilted its head the other direction, and made a sound that was unmistakably, impossibly a purr. The betting pool on Jake's survival time immediately became null and void. The silence that followed the purring was the kind of silence that accompanies events that break fundamental laws of physics, nature, and common sense. It was the silence of a universe suddenly realizing it might need to update its operating manual. Professor Kethvar's recording equipment was still running, but his expression suggested he was questioning whether he was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Pip had achieved a level of transparency that technically qualified him as legally invisible. Thane's crystal structure was producing sounds like a wind chime having an existential crisis. Jake, meanwhile, reached out and gently scratched behind one of the Voidstalker's ears. The purring got louder. "There's a good girl," Jake said conversationally, as if he were addressing a particularly large house cat, rather than a creature capable of phasing through reality to hunt prey. "You're just curious about the weird-smelling alien, aren't you?" The Voidstalker leaned into the ear scratch, and her constellation-patterned fur began shifting to lighter colors, creating what appeared to be a galactic aurora across her coat. This was apparently the Voidstalker equivalent of a contented sigh. "That's not possible," Professor Kethvar managed, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire academic career had just been drop-kicked into the nearest black hole. "Voidstalkers don't form social bonds with prey species. They're apex predators. They hunt. They kill. They don't purr." "Oh, she's definitely an apex predator," Jake agreed, now scratching under the hatchling's chin while she made sounds that could have powered a small space station. "Look at those beautiful teeth, and those claws, perfectly designed for taking down large prey. The phase-shifting ability is fascinating, too. I bet she uses it to bypass armor plating on larger targets." The class stared in fascinated horror as Jake conducted what amounted to a lecture on predator anatomy while said predator melted into a 200-pound puddle of contentment. "But here's the thing about apex predators," Jake continued, apparently addressing his audience while never stopping the ear scratches. "They're smart. Really smart. And smart predators don't waste energy on fights they don't need to have. She can smell that I'm not afraid of her. Which means either I'm too stupid to live, or I'm dangerous enough that attacking me would be a bad idea. And since I'm not running around screaming and bleeding, she's probably figured out it's option 2. Thane managed to form words through his structural damage. "You're dangerous, but you're human. Your species barely qualified for galactic citizenship. Your homeworld is classified as primitive by galactic standards." Jake paused in his scratching to give Thane a look that was equal parts amused and pitying. "Thane, buddy, what classification does your computer system give Earth in the galactic database?" Primitive civilization, limited space travel, early industrial development, Thane recited automatically. Although there's a notation about, oh, Death World, Jake finished cheerfully. Class 9 Death World, to be specific. Do you know what it takes for a planet to earn that classification? It means the local ecosystem is so aggressively hostile that simply existing there qualifies as an extreme sport. The Void Stalker had now sprawled across Jake's feet like a cat claiming ownership, her purring creating small vibrations in the reinforced floor. Jake absently scratched between her shoulder blades while continuing his impromptu lecture. See, the thing about growing up on a death world is that you learn to read predator behavior really, really well, because if you don't, you become part of the food chain. My mom's a xenobiologist specializing in dangerous species preservation. Our backyard had things that would make your Void Stalker here look like a cuddle toy. He glanced down at the hatchling, who was now making sounds that suggested she was approximately 30 seconds away from falling asleep on his feet. Speaking of which, you need a name, don't you? How about Patches? You've got those lovely star panther patches in your fur. Patches opened one glowing eye, seemed to consider this, then closed it again and continued purring. My little sister Emma, Jake continued. Her current pet is what we call a shadow drake. Imagine a dragon that phases in and out of dimensions, breathes concentrated nightmare, and considers Void Stalkers a light snack. Emma's had him since she was 7, named him Mr. Snuggles. He follows her to school and plays fetch. The classroom had achieved a level of quiet usually associated with the vacuum of space. Even the air recycling system seemed to have paused to listen. The point being, Jake said, gently moving Patches off his feet so he could stand up. Humans didn't get to the top of Earth's food chain by being the biggest or the strongest or the fastest. We got there by being the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most socially cooperative apex predators the galaxy has ever produced. We're persistence hunters. We form pack bonds with anything that shows intelligence and reciprocal affection, and we have an unfortunate tendency to adopt dangerous animals as pets. He looked around the room at his fellow students, who were staring at him with expressions ranging from newfound respect to barely controlled terror. Also, for the record, Earth isn't classified as primitive. That's just what we tell people so they don't panic. Hard to maintain diplomatic relations when everyone knows you're from the galactic equivalent of Australia. Professor Kethvar had stopped recording. His academic worldview was undergoing what could generously be called a complete paradigm shift, and more accurately be described as a total collapse. So, Jake said brightly, offering his sandwich crusts to Patches, who accepted them with the dignity of a creature that had just discovered that humans came with built-in snack dispensers. Who wants to learn about proper predator socialization techniques? Because I'm pretty sure this wasn't covered in your textbooks. Patches crunched thoughtfully on the sandwich crusts, her star-potter fur shifting to warmer colors that suggested contentment, trust, and the beginning of what would undoubtedly become a legendary interspecies friendship. And in the back of his mind, Jake could practically hear his little sister's voice saying, "Wait until they meet Mom." Professor Kethavar had reached that special stage of academic distress where his entire understanding of xenobiology was crumbling in real time. His carefully planned exercise in controlled terror had somehow transformed into what appeared to be an impromptu adoption ceremony between a human and one of the galaxy's most feared predators. This was not going according to any of his lesson plans. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, watching Jake demonstrate proper predator massage techniques to a class of traumatized students while Patches rolled onto her back like an oversized dimension-phasing kitten. Void Stalkers don't bond with alien species. They're apex predators. They have instincts, protocols, natural behaviors that don't include purring and accepting belly rubs from mammals they should be eating. Jake looked up from where he was explaining the optimal pressure points for relaxing a stressed predator. "Professor, have you actually spent much time around Void Stalkers? Because their behavioral patterns suggest they're highly intelligent social hunters. Pack dynamics, territory sharing, cooperative child rearing. Of course they form bonds with other species if those species demonstrate non-threatening alpha behaviors." Non-threatening alpha behaviors? Professor Kethvar's skin had taken on a distinctly green tinge that suggested his stress levels were approaching critical mass. "You're describing theoretical xenopsychology that hasn't been proven in controlled conditions." "Right, well, sometimes theory and practice don't exactly align," Jake said diplomatically, while Patches made sounds that indicated she was approximately 30 seconds away from a food coma. "Speaking of which, shouldn't Mama be looking for her baby about now? Because if I were a parent-sized Void Stalker and my kid had been gone for more than an hour, I'd probably be getting a little concerned." The words had barely left Jake's mouth when every piece of electronic equipment in the laboratory began screaming warnings simultaneously. Emergency lights bathed the room in pulsing red, the reinforced walls started vibrating with a low harmonic that seemed to come from somewhere outside normal space-time, and the temperature dropped about 15 degrees in the span of 3 seconds. Professor Kethvar went from green to a pale yellow that suggested imminent cardiovascular failure. Oh, no. Oh, no, 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 no! The containment protocols, the parent tracking systems. I never activated the parent tracking systems. Parent tracking systems? Pip managed to whisper, his form now so translucent he was basically a worried voice with optical suggestions. Standard procedure when working with juvenile apex predators. Professor Kethvar explained in the tone of someone explaining exactly how they'd accidentally triggered a galactic incident. You suppress the parent's ability to locate their offspring during educational exercises. Otherwise they tend to, well, retrieve them, aggressively. The wall exploded. Not metaphorically. The reinforced, battle-tested, designed to contain small nuclear explosions wall simply ceased to exist in a spray of molecular debris in what appeared to be very angry starlight. What came through the hole was everything that Patches would become when she grew up, except larger, angrier, and possessed of the kind of maternal fury that made supernovas look like gentle mood lighting. Adult Theo Voidstalker, approximately 8 feet at the shoulder, weighing in at what had to be close to half a ton, and radiating the kind of predatory menace that made hardened Space Marines reconsider their career choices. Her constellation fur was shifting through colors that didn't have names. Her eyes blazed with an inner light that suggested she was personally offended by the continued existence of everything in the room. And when she opened her mouth to roar, the sound bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to the part of the brain that handled existential terror. The remaining students scattered like physics-defying prey animals. Thane's crystal structure finally gave up entirely, and he collapsed into what appeared to be a pile of very expensive gravel. Pip achieved complete invisibility through what was probably a combination of terror and evolutionary advancement. Professor Kethvar dove behind his desk and began frantically searching for the emergency evacuation controls. Jake looked up at the 8-foot-tall nightmare that had just redecorated the laboratory through applied demolition, took in the blazing eyes, the extended claws, the ready-to-murder-everything posture, and said, "Ma'am, I believe this belongs to you." He gently nudged Patches, who had been dozing contentedly through what amounted to a controlled explosion, and pointed toward her mother. Patches opened her eyes, saw her parent, and made a sound that was part purr, part squeak, and entirely, "Mom, look what I found." The adult Voidstalker's fury-blazing eyes locked onto Jake, who was standing calmly next to her offspring with his hands visible and his posture relaxed. Every predatory instinct she possessed was screaming that this small, strange-smelling biped should be running, bleeding, or preferably both. Instead, he was standing there like he owned the place, smiling at her the way you might smile at a neighbor's dog. "She's beautiful," Jake said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather rather than addressing a creature that could phase through reality to disembowel him. "Great bone structure, excellent muscle development, and those constellation patterns are absolutely gorgeous. You've done excellent work raising her." Patches padded over to her mother and proceeded to rub against her legs while purring loud enough to rattle the remaining intact equipment. The message was clear. The weird bipedal thing was friend, not food, and also he gave excellent ear scratches and had snacks. The adult Voidstalker looked down at her offspring, then back at Jake, then down at Patches again. Her blazing eyes narrowed as she processed this information. Patches continued purring and occasionally glancing back at Jake with what could only be described as obvious affection. Slowly, carefully, the adult Voidstalker approached Jake with the kind of movement that suggested she was ready to phase out of reality and remove his head from his shoulders at the first sign of threat. Jake remained perfectly still, hands visible, posture relaxed, meeting her gaze with calm confidence. She stopped just close enough that her breathing ruffled his hair, leaned down and sniffed him thoroughly. Jake waited patiently while she conducted what amounted to a full predatory assessment, her nose taking in everything from his stress hormones to his breakfast choices. Finally, she sat back on her haunches and made a sound that was part query, part demand, and entirely "explain yourself, small strange thing." "Your daughter's incredibly intelligent," Jake said, reaching slowly into his pocket, "and she has excellent instincts for reading non-threatening behavior. Mind if I give her the rest of my snacks? She seemed to enjoy them." He produced what appeared to be some kind of jerky and offered it to Patches, who accepted it with obvious delight. The adult Voidstalker watched this interaction with the kind of attention usually reserved for complex mathematical equations that might explode if solved incorrectly. The thing about apex predators, Jake continued, settling into what was clearly going to be another impromptu lecture while sharing snacks with two creatures that could theoretically reduce him to component atoms, is that you're not just built for hunting, you're built for making smart decisions about when to hunt and when not to. Your daughter figured out I wasn't prey pretty much immediately. She's got good judgment. The adult Voidstalker tilted her head, processing this information. Her fur patterns were slowly shifting from anger red to something approaching cautious curiosity. Plus, Jake added with a grin that was becoming increasingly familiar to his traumatized classmates, humans are persistent predators. We don't hunt things that can fight back effectively unless we absolutely have to. We're much better at making friends with dangerous things and convincing them to hunt cooperatively. It's more efficient. He looked around the destroyed laboratory, taking in the cowering professor, the crystalline debris that had formerly been Thane, and the space where Pip used to be visible. Also, for what it's worth, I think this practical exam just became a lot more educational than anyone planned. Both Voidstalkers were now flanking him like oversized, interdimensional guard dogs, and Jake seemed perfectly comfortable with this arrangement. The adult had settled into a position that suggested she was prepared to remove any threats to either her offspring or the strange biped who had somehow earned pack status in the span of 10 minutes. Now then, Jake said cheerfully, who wants to learn about proper interspecies diplomatic protocol with apex predator families? Because I'm pretty sure this is going to be on next week's exam. From behind his desk, Professor Kethvar made a sound that suggested his academic worldview had not just collapsed, but had been systematically demolished and then set on fire for good measure. And somewhere in the back of Jake's mind, his little sister's voice whispered, "Mom's going to love this story." 1 week later, Xenobiology 101 had undergone what Professor Kethvar diplomatically referred to in his incident reports as significant pedagogical restructuring. What he meant was that his entire course curriculum had been thrown out the airlock and replaced with something that bore no resemblance to traditional galactic education standards. The classroom itself had been renovated to accommodate what the administration euphemistically called expanded learning requirements. This meant reinforced floors capable of supporting half-ton interdimensional predators, climate control systems designed for species that generated their own localized weather patterns, and emergency medical facilities that could handle everything from crystalline structural collapse to existential transparency syndrome. Jake arrived for class 15 minutes early, as had become his habit, carrying his usual assortment of snacks and what appeared to be a new textbook titled Interspecies Pack Dynamics and You, a practical guide to not getting eaten by your study partners. He settled into his usual seat, which now came equipped with reinforced supports and what looked suspiciously like a small feeding station. Patches materialized next to his chair through a brief phase shift that made the air shimmer like heat waves, her constellation fur displaying colors that clearly indicated contentment and anticipation. She had grown noticeably in the past week, now approaching the size of a small shuttle, but her behavior around Jake remained that of an oversized, interdimensional house cat with a PhD in applied physics. "Morning, beautiful," Jake said, scratching behind her ears while she settled into what had become her designated spot beside his desk. "Ready for today's lesson on toxic plant identification? I brought extra snacks in case any of them try to bite back." The other students filtered in with the cautious movements of people who had recently discovered that their definition of normal classroom experience needed significant expansion. Pip had achieved a new level of controlled visibility that suggested he was learning to manage his stress responses, though he still flickered occasionally when startled. Thane had been medically reconstructed and now sported several stress distribution modifications that made him look like a living amethyst sculpture, with built-in shock absorbers. The new student seating arrangement reflected the changed power dynamics. Everyone sat in a careful semicircle around Jake and Patches, close enough to benefit from what Professor Kethvar had grudgingly admitted was exceptional practical knowledge, but far enough away to avoid accidental dismemberment if Patches got excited during demonstrations. Professor Kethvar entered the classroom with the resigned air of someone whose entire academic career had been hijacked by circumstances beyond his control. His traditional Vorthak robes had been replaced with something that looked suspiciously like protective gear, and he carried a datapad that was approximately 3 times thicker than his original syllabus. "Good morning, students," he announced, his voice carrying only the faintest trace of existential despair. "Today, we will be examining the behavioral patterns of carnivorous flora, with particular emphasis on species that demonstrate active hunting behaviors. He gestured to a collection of containment units that had been arranged at the front of the classroom, each one humming with the kind of energy fields usually reserved for containing small stars. These specimens have been carefully selected from various death worlds throughout the galaxy, and I must emphasize that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to interact with them directly. Jake raised his hand. Professor, are these the Crimson Snappers from Hellion Prime? Because if they are, you might want to adjust your containment frequencies. They're really sensitive to electromagnetic interference, and those fields are probably making them cranky. Professor Kethvar paused in his lecture setup, looking at Jake with the expression of someone who had learned not to question how a human could possibly know obscure details about alien Death World flora. They are indeed Crimson Snappers, Mr. Martinez. And how, precisely, would you know about their electromagnetic sensitivity? My mom's preservation facility has a whole greenhouse section dedicated to carnivorous plants from high radiation environments, Jake explained cheerfully, while Patches made interested chirping sounds that suggested she remembered something tasty from her own experience. Emma used to help with feeding time when she was younger. She's got this trick where she can get them to sing in harmony. It's actually pretty relaxing once you get used to the fact that they're technically trying to lure you into digestive range. The class sat in the kind of silence that accompanies revelations that fundamentally alter your understanding of what constitutes normal family activities. Your sister taught carnivorous plants to sing? Pip managed, his form solidifying slightly with what appeared to be horrified fascination. Well, they already knew how to sing, Jake clarified. She just taught them to do it cooperatively. Emma's got this theory that most predatory species are actually highly social once you figure out how to communicate with them properly. She's working on a doctoral thesis about it. Something about applied xenopsychological harmonics and cooperative hunting behaviors. Thane's crystal structure made a small pinging sound that indicated controlled stress rather than impending collapse. How old is your sister? 14 last month. Mom threw her a party in the Dangerous Species Conservation Center. Emma insisted on inviting all her favorite specimens. The Shadow Drake made friends with a pack of void wolves, and they spent the afternoon playing what I can only describe as interdimensional tag. It was actually pretty cute, once you got past the fact that any one of them could have accidentally erased a small moon. Professor Kethvar set down his datapad and looked directly at Jake with the expression of someone who had finally arrived at the heart of a mystery that had been bothering him for weeks. Mr. Martinez, exactly what does your mother do for a living? Jake's expression shifted slightly, taking on the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was choosing his words with unusual precision. He's the director of xenobiological preservation for the Sol System Conservation Initiative. Officially, her job is maintaining genetic diversity for endangered species and conducting research into the behavioral patterns of high-risk life forms. Unofficially, her job is making sure that the really dangerous stuff doesn't get loose and accidentally terrorize the galactic community. He glanced around the classroom, taking in the expressions of dawning understanding on his classmates' faces. Earth isn't just a death world, guys. It's a death world that decided to become the galaxy's unofficial rehabilitation center for species that are too dangerous to exist anywhere else. We specialize in taking apex predators that other civilizations consider extinct-level threats and turning them into, well, family pets. Patches chose that moment to demonstrate her affection by rubbing her head against Jake's shoulder, with enough force to knock over a small building. Jake absently scritched behind her ears while continuing his explanation. The thing about humans is that we're really good at forming pack bonds with things that should theoretically eat us. It's probably because we evolved alongside some of the nastiest predators the galaxy has ever produced, so our survival strategy became make friends with the dangerous things and convince them we're more useful alive than dead. He looked directly at Professor Kethvar, whose academic understanding was undergoing what could charitably be described as a complete paradigm shift. Also, for the record, Mom says hi. She's been following your research on apex predator behavioral modification, and she thinks your work on containment protocols shows real promise. She was wondering if you'd be interested in a consulting position with the Conservation Initiative. Something about expanding the program to include more traditional educational partnerships. Professor Kethvar's skin went through several color changes that suggested his brain was processing information faster than his physiology could handle. Your mother knows my research? Professor, my mom knows everyone's research. When you're responsible for keeping the galaxy's most dangerous life forms happy, healthy, and properly socialized, you tend to stay current with the literature. Plus, she's always looking for people who understand that apex predators aren't monsters. They're just really effective at their jobs, and their job happens to be being apex predators. Jake stood up, gathering his supplies while Patches stretched and began the process of phase shifting back to wherever Voidstalkers spent their off month. Anyway, I should probably mention that she's planning a visit next month, something about conducting a formal evaluation of the university's xenobiology program and possibly establishing a practical training partnership. She's bringing some of the friendlier specimens for demonstration purposes. The classroom fell silent except for the humming of containment fields and the distant sound of Thane's crystal structure recalibrating itself for maximum stress distribution. "Define friendly," Professor Kethvar said weakly. Jake's grin was pure human mischief wrapped in deceptive innocence. "Well, she's definitely bringing Mr. Snuggles," Emma insisted. "And probably a few of the nightmare butterflies from the Andromeda Research Station. They're actually really sweet once you get to know them, even if they do accidentally induce temporary psychosis in most oxygen-breathing species." He headed toward the door, pausing to give Patches one final ear scratch before she completed her phase shift. "Oh, and Professor? You might want to update your emergency medical protocols. Mom's bringing her own medical team, but they specialize in treating injuries that technically shouldn't be possible according to known physics. Just a heads up." As Jake left the classroom, Professor Kethvar slowly sat down at his desk and stared at his carefully prepared lesson plan on carnivorous plant safety protocols. After a long moment, he opened a new document on his datapad and began typing a message to the university administration with the subject line, "Request for immediate administrative review, potential paradigm-shifting educational partnership opportunity." And in the distance, the sound of interdimensional purring suggested that some friendships transcend species boundaries, dimensional barriers, and the traditional definitions of what constitutes appropriate classroom pets. The galaxy was about to discover that when humans said "we come in peace," what they actually meant was, "We come with friendship, snacks, and a comprehensive understanding of how to turn your nightmares into study buddies." It was going to be an interesting semester.